There is a moment in a person's life when the consequences they have outrun for years finally begin to outrun them. And that moment has arrived for the narcissist, who thought losing you was just another game they could win later. They are not struggling. They are not figuring things out. They are falling fast, reckless, and blind, straight into disaster. You may not see it publicly yet. You may only sense it in fragments. But beneath the surface, something is collapsing at a speed they cannot control. And it began the moment you were removed from their reach. They are falling straight into disaster. This is not poetic language. It is trajectory. Their life is no longer moving in careful steps. It is accelerating in unstable directions. Decisions are being made without foresight. Words are being spoken without restraint. Bridges are being burned without consideration of what comes next. There is a difference between confidence and recklessness. Confidence is steady. Recklessness is frantic. And what you are witnessing now is frantic. The narcissist once thrived on control. They curated perception. They managed narratives. They kept enough stability around them to maintain the illusion of power. But once you were gone, that illusion lost its foundation. You were not just a partner. You were a regulator. You absorbed tension. You softened reactions. You brought equilibrium without even realizing it. Without that stabilizing presence, the cracks widened. And when cracks widen under pride, collapse follows quickly. They are now reacting instead of thinking, provoking instead of reflecting, escaping instead of confronting. And when a person begins living purely on impulse, disaster is not a possibility, it is an inevitability. This is not about wishing harm. It is about recognizing gravity. A life fueled by ego and sustained by control cannot remain upright once control is removed. And that removal happened when God separated you from them. Hatred is now driving them. When a narcissist realizes that control has slipped beyond their reach, something shifts beneath the surface. It is not sorrow that rises first. It is not reflection. It is not repentance. It is hatred. Not always loud at first. Not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, cold, calculated, simmering beneath forced smiles and carefully crafted words. But it is there, and it is growing, because what they lost was not simply a relationship. They lost dominance. They lost access. They lost the ability to pull you back with a look, a word, or a crisis. And for someone whose identity was built on influence, that loss feels like exposure. For years, they operated under the assumption that you would remain within reach, that no matter how they treated you, you would circle back, that your forgiveness was predictable, that your compassion was permanent. But when you did not return, when your silence became consistent, when your absence became stable, something inside them fractured. And fractured pride rarely produces humility. It produces resentment. Hatred, in this case, is not simply anger toward you. It is anger toward the reality that they can no longer control the narrative. They cannot rewrite history in your mind. They cannot soften the truth. They cannot reposition themselves as the hero in your story. And that loss of control feels unbearable. So instead of looking inward, they look outward. They may speak ill of you. They may distort events. They may attempt to paint themselves as misunderstood or mistreated. They may surround themselves with people who validate their version of events. But underneath all of that noise is one unspoken truth. They cannot stand that you walked away with your dignity intact. That kind of exit destabilizes a narcissistic personality more than any confrontation ever could. For someone who thrived on your emotional responses, your calm becomes infuriating. For someone who fed on your attention, your indifference becomes threatening. For someone who relied on your patience, your boundaries become offensive. Hatred becomes their fuel. It justifies reckless behavior. It rationalizes impulsive decisions. It numbs the sting of humiliation. But hatred is a poor architect. It builds nothing stable. It only accelerates collapse. And here is what makes this season particularly sobering. Their hatred is not strengthening them. It is exhausting them. You may notice increased volatility, shorter tempers, riskier choices, relationships formed quickly and destroyed even faster, conflicts where none were necessary. This is not strength. It is instability disguised as confidence. Scripture tells us that a person who lacks self-control is like a city with broken walls. Once the walls are down, anything can enter: anger, envy, paranoia, reckless impulses. And when self-restraint erodes, consequences move closer. Their hatred is not only directed at you, it is directed at the mirror, at the quiet realization that they misjudged you, at the truth that you were stronger than they anticipated, at the uncomfortable awareness that the one person they assumed would always stay did not. That realization is deeply destabilizing for someone whose identity depends on being chosen, admired, pursued. Now they are the one left reaching, and they do not know how to handle that position. So hatred becomes their shield. But shields made of anger eventually crack under pressure, because anger cannot replace identity, resentment cannot restore control, and reckless pride cannot rebuild what humility refused to protect. As their hatred intensifies, so does their instability. And instability, when left unchecked, always points toward disaster. If they cannot have you, they're lost. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a person unravel, not because they were abandoned, but because they can no longer possess. And that is the core of what is happening here. When a narcissist says, or silently believes, "If I can't have you, nothing matters," it is not romance, it is not heartbreak in its purest form. It is dependency wrapped in entitlement. For years, perhaps longer than you fully realized, you were not simply a partner in their life. You were a stabilizing force. You were affirmation. You were validation. You were the emotional mirror, reflecting back the image they needed in order to feel significant. Without you, they are not just lonely, they are disoriented. Because people who build their identity on control do not know how to exist when that control disappears. You must understand something important. They did not lose love the way you did. They lost leverage. They lost access. They lost the ability to call, provoke, manipulate, charm, or guilt you into orbiting back around them. And once that orbit was broken, their internal compass began spinning. This is why their behavior looks so chaotic right now. It is not simply anger. It is loss of orientation. When God separated you from them, He did more than remove proximity. He interrupted their supply chain. The emotional reinforcement they relied on to regulate their ego is no longer available. The person who absorbed their volatility is no longer standing in front of them, and now they are left with themselves. For a healthy person, that might lead to introspection. For a narcissistic personality, it often leads to panic, because sitting alone with themselves reveals something they have worked very hard to avoid: insecurity. Without you, there is no steady affirmation, no predictable admiration, no reliable emotional feedback loop. And without that loop, their sense of self begins to flicker. So what do? They chase distractions. They rush into new connections, not because they are healed, but because they are empty. They seek attention, not because they are confident, but because silence is too loud. They surround themselves with noise, so they do not have to hear the uncomfortable truth that you were more essential to their emotional stability than they ever admitted. But here is what makes this spiral especially telling. The more they try to replace you, the more obvious it becomes that you were irreplaceable in their system, because new people do not regulate them the way you did. New admiration does not land the same way. New conversations do not steady their nervous system, and that frustration compounds. They are not grieving you in a healthy way. They are reacting to the collapse of control. There is a difference. Grief humbles a person. Control withdrawal destabilizes them. You may notice that their choices now seem exaggerated, faster relationships, louder statements, riskier decisions. It is because they are trying to fill a vacuum that cannot be filled externally. They are lost, not spiritually abandoned, not hopeless in the ultimate sense, but lost in identity. Because when a person builds their sense of worth on possession, and the possession walks away, they do not know who they are anymore. That is the truth they are confronting, and it is deeply uncomfortable. They may pretend they are thriving. They may project strength. They may claim indifference. But beneath that performance is a person who no longer knows how to steady themselves without you. And that instability is driving the recklessness you are seeing. When someone cannot have you and built their ego around having you, the loss is not romantic. It is destabilizing. And destabilized pride, left unchecked, does not drift quietly. It crashes loudly. Reckless living has become their escape. When a person loses control of someone they once possessed, there are two possible paths: reflection or reaction. Reflection requires humility. Reaction requires nothing but impulse. And the narcissist, unable to tolerate the quiet exposure of self-examination, chooses reaction. That is why what you are seeing now feels louder, faster, more unstable. Recklessness is no longer occasional. It has become habitual. It shows up in sudden decisions that make no long-term sense. It appears in relationships formed overnight, with people who barely know them. It surfaces in arguments that escalate beyond proportion, in financial risks taken without wisdom, in indulgences that look less like celebration and more like avoidance. To the outside observer, it may look like freedom, but freedom has structure. This is not freedom. This is escape. When the internal world becomes too uncomfortable to sit with, some people will run not physically, but behaviorally. They will chase stimulation because silence forces self-awareness. They will seek applause because solitude exposes insecurity. They will create chaos because chaos is easier to manage than conviction. The narcissist's recklessness is not confidence expanding. It is restraint eroding. And when restraint erodes, consequences draw nearer. Consider this carefully. When you were present in their life, there were boundaries they respected, even if reluctantly. There were behaviors they moderated, even if temporarily. There were moments when your calm steadied their impulse. Your presence required them to perform a version of themselves that appeared controlled. Now there is no audience they respect enough to perform for. And without that external regulator, their impulses are unchecked. They may spend excessively to prove success. They may flaunt new relationships to provoke jealousy. They may speak boldly in ways that burn reputations. They may gamble with opportunities that once would have mattered deeply. But underneath every reckless move is the same unspoken confession: I cannot sit still with what I have lost. Recklessness becomes anesthesia. It numbs the sting of humiliation. It dulls the awareness that they miscalculated. It distracts from the realization that the person they assumed would always return did not. For some, this recklessness takes the form of unhealthy habits. For others, it appears in aggressive social behavior. For others still, it manifests in professional overreach, biting off more than they can sustain because appearing strong feels safer than admitting weakness. But no matter the form, the pattern is identical. They are operating without guardrails. And Scripture warns us that a person without self-control is like a city with broken walls, exposed to every invading force. When walls fall, enemies do not need invitation. Impulses enter, poor counsel enters, temptation enters, and eventually collapse enters. What makes this season especially sobering is that the recklessness is accelerating. When a person feels they have nothing left to lose, they behave as if consequences no longer apply. But consequences do not disappear simply because someone feels desperate. In fact, desperation often amplifies them. This is why you may sense a tightening in the atmosphere around them, a growing instability, a pattern of near misses becoming closer calls. Recklessness feels thrilling in the beginning, but it always extracts a price, and the longer it continues, the higher that price becomes. The safety net is gone. There is a difference between judgment falling and protection being lifted. Many people imagine divine intervention as lightning striking from the sky, dramatic, unmistakable, immediate, but more often, the unfolding of consequences happens in a quieter, more sobering way. Sometimes God does not push a person down. He simply steps back and allows gravity to do what gravity has always done. For a long time, the narcissist in your life seemed to escape the full weight of their choices. Conflicts that should have cost them dearly somehow softened. Situations that could have exploded instead dissolved. Words spoken carelessly did not always produce the backlash they deserved. You may have wondered how they continued to land on their feet, but consider this carefully. While you were present in their life, there was intercession. There were prayers whispered in private. There was grace extended repeatedly. There was a stabilizing influence that absorbed shockwaves before they reached full impact. You may not have seen yourself that way, but your presence mattered more than you realized. You were often the quiet buffer between their impulse and the world's reaction. When they overstepped, you softened it. When they reacted, you de-escalated it. When they made poor decisions, you often worked behind the scenes to repair damage. And sometimes, even spiritually, your prayers created covering. Now you are no longer there. And the covering that flowed through your obedience, your compassion, your restraint, is no longer positioned around them. This is not vindictive. It is structural. If someone stands under a roof during a storm, they remain dry. If they step outside the covering, the rain does not increase in anger, it simply falls as it always has. The difference is exposure. Since your separation, the near misses are becoming direct hits. The small warnings are becoming tangible consequences. Where once they might have talked their way out of trouble, now doors close more quickly. Where once charm deflected accountability, now people are less persuaded. Where once timing seemed to protect them, now patterns are catching up. It may appear sudden from the outside, but in reality, it is accumulated momentum, finally encountering resistance. The safety net is gone, and without that net, every reckless decision lands harder. This is often how divine discipline unfolds, not as spectacle, but as removal of insulation. God does not need to orchestrate catastrophe for a person determined to ignore wisdom. Sometimes He allows the person to experience the full weight of what they have chosen. For years, they leaned on your stability without honoring it. They relied on your forgiveness without valuing it. They benefited from your loyalty without protecting it. But once you were removed, so was the cushion. Now, when they leap impulsively, the ground feels closer. When they speak rashly, relationships fracture more easily. When they push limits, consequences arrive without delay. It is sobering to watch, especially for someone who once appeared untouchable. But untouchable was always an illusion sustained by borrowed grace. Without humility, borrowed grace does not last. And without covering, Recklessness meets resistance quickly. This is not about celebrating their hardship. It is about understanding that protection is not automatic. When a person repeatedly refuses correction, eventually protection shifts into discipline. And discipline, though painful, is not cruelty. It is clarity. They are watching you obsessively. While their life grows more unstable, there is one thing that has not loosened its grip on them. You. Not in the healthy way that longs for reconciliation with humility, not in the mature way that blesses and releases, but in the restless, unsettled, searching way of someone who cannot accept that the chapter has closed. They are watching, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes openly, often silently. They check your social media. They ask mutual acquaintances subtle questions. They look for changes in your routine. They scan for signs of who might now occupy the space they once assumed was permanently theirs. And what disturbs them most is not your words. It is your stability. Your silence unsettles them more than confrontation ever did. Because silence communicates something final. Silence says you have stepped into a different rhythm of life. Silence says you are no longer orbiting around their moods. Silence says you are not waiting. For someone who built their sense of importance around your responsiveness, this is deeply destabilizing. They once measured their influence by how quickly you reacted. Now there is no reaction to measure. And that absence creates obsession. Understand this clearly. Obsession is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and calculating. It is the late-night scroll through your photos. It is the repeated visit to your profile. It is the subtle inquiry to a mutual friend. Have you heard from them? They may pretend indifference publicly, but privately, curiosity consumes them. Why? Because your growth is evidence. Evidence that they were not as central to your survival as they believed. Evidence that you are not broken without them. Evidence that God did not allow your life to collapse when the relationship ended. For someone who depended on being your emotional axis, this is unsettling. They may wonder if you are dating. They may speculate about who is encouraging you now. They may imagine scenarios in which someone else is speaking the words they once took for granted. And that thought alone stirs jealousy that borders on panic. Not because they suddenly understand love in a pure way, but because they understand replacement. They never believed you would truly detach. They believed distance was temporary. They believed you would eventually soften, but your consistency has proven otherwise. And that consistency forces them to confront a reality they tried to dismiss. You are not coming back to the dynamic they controlled. So they watch, and every sign of your peace feels like a contradiction to their internal narrative. They told themselves you would struggle. They convinced themselves you would regret leaving. They assumed you would reach out, but instead you are steady, perhaps quieter than before, perhaps less reactive, perhaps more guarded, but steady. And that steadiness highlights their instability. There is a kind of torment in watching someone thrive when you expected them to crumble. It exposes miscalculation. It confronts pride. It amplifies insecurity. Your progress has become a mirror they cannot avoid. And what they see in that mirror is not just your growth. It is their loss. They see what they forfeited. They see what they mishandled. They see what they underestimated. And that realization fuels both obsession and agitation. You may even sense this spiritually, a feeling of being watched, evaluated, monitored. You may feel prompted to limit what you share. That prompting is wisdom, because not every eye watching you is cheering. Some are studying, but here is what matters most. Their watching does not give them access. Their curiosity does not restore connection. Their fixation does not grant influence. God separated you, and separation means access is restricted. They can observe from a distance, but they cannot enter. They can speculate, but they cannot steer. They can wonder, but they cannot control. And that is perhaps the most destabilizing reality of all, because control was their comfort, and now they are outside the circle of it, watching, unsettled, unable to reach what they once assumed they owned. The disaster becomes inevitable. There comes a point in every pattern of unchecked behavior where momentum overtakes intention. At first, the narcissist believed they were still steering. They thought the anger was temporary. They thought the recklessness was manageable. They thought the late-night impulses, the risky decisions, the damaged relationships were all reversible. But momentum has a way of building quietly. One impulsive choice rarely destroys a life, but repeated impulsive choices create a trajectory, and trajectories, if not corrected, end in collision. What we are witnessing now is not a sudden catastrophe appearing out of nowhere. It is accumulation. It is pride layered upon pride. It is avoidance layered upon avoidance. It is recklessness layered upon humiliation. And eventually, the layers become too heavy to sustain. Disaster does not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives as exposure. Sometimes it arrives as isolation. Sometimes it arrives as doors closing that once opened easily. Sometimes it arrives as a single event that reveals a long-standing pattern. For years, they managed to maintain an image. They curated perception carefully. They deflected blame skillfully. They moved between circles without losing footing. But instability has been growing beneath the surface. And instability cannot remain hidden forever. When anger drives decisions, relationships fracture. When ego overrides wisdom, opportunities erode. When resentment fuels communication, reputations suffer. It may look like one dramatic moment from the outside, a public conflict, a professional failure, a relational collapse. But those moments are rarely isolated. They are the visible crack of a structure that has been weakening internally for some time. Scripture speaks often about sowing and reaping, not as punishment in a theatrical sense, but as consequence embedded into creation itself. You reap what you sow. If you sow pride, you harvest separation. If you sow recklessness, you harvest instability. If you sow control without love, you harvest loneliness. And that harvest does not arrive because someone wished it into existence. It arrives because patterns bear fruit. The narcissist believed they could outmaneuver consequence. They believed charm could indefinitely substitute for character. They believed deflection could replace accountability. But there is a threshold where even charm grows thin. People begin to see the pattern. Tolerance decreases, trust diminishes, and when trust diminishes, support systems shrink. That is when disaster becomes inevitable. Not because God is eager to destroy, but because discipline eventually steps in where denial refuses to leave. When protection has been withdrawn and restraint has been ignored, impact is only a matter of time. You may sense this building. You may hear rumors. You may observe changes that signal tightening pressure. It might manifest as financial instability after reckless spending. It might surface as strained professional relationships after impulsive speech. It might appear in personal circles where once loyal allies grow distant. Whatever the form, the pattern is consistent. They are no longer gliding above consequence. They are descending into it. And here is the sobering truth. They cannot blame you for this. They may try. They may attempt to frame their instability as the result of your departure, but your departure did not create their character. It revealed it. You did not plant recklessness in them. You remove the cushion that softened its impact. And once the cushion is gone, the fall feels steeper. Disaster, in this context, is not a single dramatic event. It is the unavoidable outcome of living without correction for too long. And when that outcome finally arrives, it often feels sudden to the one experiencing it. But to those who have watched the pattern unfold, it feels inevitable. While they fall, you are being positioned. As their instability intensifies and consequences gather momentum, something equally profound is happening on the other side of this separation. You are being steadied, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by design. When God removed you from their reach, He did not leave you suspended in uncertainty. He repositioned you. What once felt like loss has slowly revealed itself as protection. What once felt like heartbreak has uncovered clarity. What once felt like rejection has exposed redirection. And that is where the value of this entire season becomes clear for you. You were not meant to collapse alongside them. You were not meant to absorb the impact of their unchecked impulses. You were not meant to keep standing between them and the consequences they refuse to face. You were meant to move forward. For many of you watching, especially those who have lived long enough to recognize patterns, this is not your first disappointment, but it may be the first time you chose peace over persuasion, silence over argument, boundaries over bargaining, and that choice matters, because every time you refuse to react, you strengthen discernment. Every time you resisted the urge to rescue, you strengthened wisdom. Every time you chose prayer over retaliation, you strengthened alignment with God rather than entanglement with chaos. That is growth. The narcissist's fall is not the center of your story. Your obedience is. Their recklessness does not define this chapter. Your stability does. And here is the deeper truth. When you allow God to separate you from instability, He does not leave you empty. He fills the space with steadiness, with sharper judgment, with deeper peace. Sometimes even with new relationships that are built on respect rather than control. The value for you is clarity. Clarity that you are not responsible for fixing someone who refuses correction. Clarity that love does not require self-erasure. Clarity that separation can be mercy. If they are falling, that is their lesson. If you are steady, that is your reward. Stay steady. Stay prayerful. Stay forward. Because the same hand that led you out is the hand that is guiding you into something healthier, wiser, and far more secure than what you left behind.